Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It is November 10th. Welcome to the JTEEN's November Professional Development Webinar. We are incredibly excited to welcome back Rabbi Mike Moskowitz, who joined us during the summer in our conference. And a lot of people completed the survey and said, we want more of Rabbi Mike. And so we invited him back today for a very open-ended webinar entitled Conversations About Gender. And just real quick, Rabbi Mike Moskowitz is the scholar in residence for trans and queer Jewish studies at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, the world's largest LGBT synagogue. He is a David Hartman Center Fellow and the author of Textual Activism. And I learned today another book is on the horizon, so I'm sure he'll let us know about that as well. Without further ado, Rabbi, the floor is yours.
Erica, thank you so much for the generous introduction, for the invitation. It's a distinct honor and pleasure to be here. Borrowing language from the queer community, I was assigned secular and then came out in high school as Orthodox. I joked that those who knew me when I was a kid, they told me they always knew. And it really wasn't until a few years ago that I was at all confronted with my own gender identity. It's something that I never really thought about. And certainly in the ultra-Orthodox world, where I was for 20 some years learning in Lakewood and in the Mir, it was only when I was a rabbi at Columbia and the rabbi of the Broadway Synagogue in Harlem, and someone in my immediate family said to me, "I'm not a girl, I'm a boy." And I asked them, "How do you know?" And it can't be the same way that I know. And he said, I just am. And it took about 3 weeks of really speaking with as many people as I could to come to what I think is a relatively evolved space of knowing that I just don't know. Part of being cisgender is a limited awareness of gender to one's body. The trans experience and the genderqueer experience is an expanded awareness of gender beyond one's body. And so the work that I do now at CBST is very broadly around trans issues, both in interdenominational and interfaith spaces. And then within the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox world, it's all sorts of LGBT issues, particularly around children coming out and spouses transitioning. So this is certainly the best it's ever been. It's not a tale of two cities, but there's a lot of work to be done. Gender identity and sexual orientation are different. Who a person is when they go to sleep is different than who they want to sleep with. Someone who is asexual is not free from gender, and they're not independent. That the ways in which society socially constructs what it means to be male or female affects all of these. And so one of the things that we're seeing in terms of trends is both unique blends of things in the gender nonconforming spaces and gender non-binary, genderqueer spaces, in addition to what has been going on now for a while, which is a trend of female to male more than male to female. The kind of the first wave of the trans experience was 3-to-1 male to female. Part of that, I think, is influenced by different ways of feminism, different waves of feminism, and what it meant to be. These words have been reclaimed, so they're no longer pejoratives, but what it meant to be like a butch kind of dyke or kind of a masculine lesbian may have lended to staying female identifying, where today, because of the different waves of feminism, might contribute a little bit to people transitioning to a male identity. So part of this is just all of this is just a way of saying that the words that we use to describe experiences are often much more limiting than the experiences they come to describe. So if you have somebody who is in a heteronormative relationship and then they transition, so you can have now a same-sex marriage where one of the people is still straight. And that's just the way it is, that love is love, and it doesn't really make a difference what we label it. We're here to be able to make the world better and to support people in the process. The struggle of allyship is often a struggle of awkwardness. It's super awkward to be an ally, in part because it's predicated on the world being broken, the world, people being dehumanized, and it's also really person specific. What can be very affirming and validating to one person can be deeply traumatic and offensive to another. And so relationship building, issues of proximity, all help create a greater intimacy to be able to know how another person is doing and what the ask may be, even if it's not articulated. One of the things that certainly we've seen in the last few years is that in certain areas of social justice, things got so bad that as awkward as it was to say something, perhaps around police brutality, or if a person is not a person of color, speaking about Black Lives Mattering, not the movement, but the idea, that felt like perhaps it wasn't the right lane. And that awkwardness was replaced with the awkwardness of saying silence. That it might not be the right thing to say, it might not be, I might not have the words, but I'm not okay with this and I can't be silent. And so part of being able to have conversations, particularly in preparation for what might be an opportunity to be an ally, or to create a space where we don't need to respond to the breakdowns in society and the micro affections, because we're able to construct something that restores both religion and justice, that we don't need to constantly be responding. We don't have to share the burden, we can remove the burden. So I want to really kind of open up conversations here today to some of these places that are the edges for you in your work, in terms of best practices, whether it's about, like Erica and I were speaking beforehand, when you have questionnaires, what's the best way of asking people pronouns without reinforcing gender binaries, without assuming that that it's only going to be one of three things, or by labeling somebody other. Part of what happens in this work today is that it's reactionary as opposed to restorative, in that we as a society are coming to answer issues in society. So we put our pronouns up here because the world misgenders people, and we want to destigmatize, and we want to make people feel comfortable and give an opportunity. But there's an unintended consequence, and there are always going to be side effects when we're trying to treat the ailment as opposed to really the symptoms, as opposed to what's really wrong. Because of all the things that I would like you to know about me, my gender is not in the top 100 that I think is relevant in terms of who I am or what I want you to know about me. And for some people, they've spent a lot of money and had many surgeries that they don't have to tell you what their pronouns are, because you should know who they are by looking at them. So there's something that is justifiable in the moment, but it also reinforces that we're not actually coming to treat what's wrong with the world as much as we're responding to things which are broken in the moment. So in thinking in broad strokes about what does it look like to try to create more of an ideal environment for students, I think it's worth taking some time to think about what does it look like to get it right, as opposed to what are all the things which are wrong, and then how do we respond to those particular things, because tomorrow it will be a new set. There'll be a new way of framing pronouns, there'll be a new set of pronouns. And so to try to live in that space, I don't know that it necessarily gets to the root of it. So I know that there was a lot of words and relatively quickly, but I want to pause and hear if folks have thoughts. This is also a safe space if anyone wants to offer a rebuttal. This is really hard, and for everybody, it's awkward and hard and draining. And there is something, I think, therapeutic about attempting to cope by trying to affect change. So as educators, you're not meant to just pass on information. You're really meant to inspire and to invest in those who are going to be the change. So I want to pause and hear folks where they're at and thoughts.
Rabbi Mike, I have a question.
Sure.
I'll start off. So I work with a lot of parents, and a lot of what I hear from parents is that gender feels to them like a moving target. And that one day, sort of what you were just talking about, one day their child may be, talking about, their female child may be talking about wanting to identify or use different pronouns than she, her. And the next day they may still be using he, him pronouns, but wanting to put a dress on or wanting to wear makeup. And there's a lot of, I think, confusion or uncertainty. And so how do we, I guess, as educators, support parents even in a way to help them navigate this often changing space?
It's a wonderful question. And as much as we rely on adults in the room to be the adults in the room, it's rarely the case, right? That we can actually expect something different from them. So part of it is also validating and affirming that struggle. Like, yeah, these are different words. Yeah, this didn't exist in the same way when you were growing up. And this might feel threatening and strange and odd. And it's lubricious, right? It's really hard to grasp. Like, I don't even understand, what does that mean to use plural pronouns? And I think part of it is to both acknowledge that and also to say that, like, it's not really consequential. You don't have to understand any of this to, like, not be a jerk about it, right? And so, like, what does it look like, right, to be able to say, listen, honey, that's super interesting. When I was a kid, this is how we understood it. Like, how has that shifted for you? Where do you think that that's coming from? And more importantly, so what does that mean in terms of me being a good parent to you? What are your needs? What's the ask here? How can I be supportive of your exploration, of your experimentation in ways which are healthy and generative? So yeah, I mean, I think that that's part of recognizing that that the lived experiences of another are not your own, and it's not unique to just these types of identities. A person meets somebody from a different religion, from a different country, from a different culture. I'm from the South, right? Some things are just different, and part of it is learning the cultural competency of a particular time and space. And I would also say that creating a healthy dynamic with people to be, for them to feel comfortable coming out and saying, hey, I'm not sure where I am going to land on this, but, like, I'm feeling that maybe the way that I was told about myself, that might not be completely true. And I'm thinking about leaning into certain things, and just want to give you a heads up. The response to that I think every parent should have is, like, that's fantastic. Like, I'm here for you. Let me know what I can do to be supportive, right? And to the extent that you have a relationship where you can kind of hopefully have already intuited that some of these things are there, right? So then you can be a good parent to be able to be, supportive without being overly influential.
Can I just follow up with that? And what about the parents who are not supportive in those conversations? Because one of the things that we're grappling with is trying to create a policy to give guidance to our faculty about how to support LGBTQ students, particularly if the parent is not supportive. What is our role vis-a-vis the parent body or the individual parents? When do we talk to parents? How do we bring them into the process when it might put the child at risk? Like, I think there's a lot of complexities there. If you could just speak about that a little bit.
There's no shortage of complexities, and there is a way in which children who are coming out as LGBT, that's a different ask than other minorities, because generally, obviously there are exceptions, but generally, let's say people of color have parents who are people of color, right? Sometimes you'll have queer parents of queer children, but the majority of queer kids are coming from non-queer parents. So there's not only are parents not right, really necessarily educated in what this is like, children don't necessarily have a role model. And so, like, it's exacerbated by all of the different, both absence of the positive and of replacing that with the negative. Particularly trans folks and broader members of the LGBT community often need to have families of choice. Teachers and rabbis and educators and community can fill a huge role in being able to say, I understand your folks aren't there yet, but in the interim, like, do you need a place, like, for Thanksgiving? You can come to, like, whatever that is in terms of the immediate stuff. I think being able to be there in that place is really important, both in thinking about the short-term needs and the long-term needs. When we think about trying to get parents there, which is the goal, it's important to understand, why aren't you there now? Like, how have you not gotten this memo yet? Now, for some people, it's maybe they were raised in a religious community that felt that taught them that God was homophobic, right? And that it's a toeva, it's an abomination. It's a different conversation if it's homophobia that they think is justifiable homophobia, because look, this is what God says. It's not me. I wouldn't hate them. It's just that God hates them. So that's like a conversation. If it's just actually independent, like, it's white supremacy type, bigotry. So then, we hope that the proximity that a parent has to a child is powerful enough that the love will conquer hate. And sometimes that needs some help in doing within religious frameworks. I think it's really important to acknowledge that what the parent thinks is a loss is in their mind real in the moment, but really that's not really the loss in reality. Many parents, care about having a particular type of child because they have a vision of a particular type of grandchild, right? And what that means down the road. And by framing that, the parent support without exception, I think, will help advance whatever their selfish desire for that child is. Meaning, if a person's observant, they want observant grandchildren. So the best way to do that is to be supportive of your kid, right? If it's about however a person sees their children as an extension of themselves and wanting them to have whatever they think is important in the world, whether that's a family or children or success, productivity, being supportive of the child and their queer experience advances that cause and being in opposition. And if we frame it as a binary, which happens often, like the first thing I'll say to a parent who will reach out and say, my daughter just came back from seminary and she came out as a lesbian. And I'll ask, is your daughter still Shomer Shabbos? Are they still observant? And they'll say yes, generally. So I'll say, look, you have a choice. You can either have a lesbian daughter that's Shomer Shabbos, or you can have a lesbian daughter that's not Shomer Shabbos. But like one of those is a choice. And so if you want to support the thing which is important, right, that's actually a choice, having something to do with you is a choice, right? As they get older and they gain independence, you can either, position yourself to be somebody who's supportive and a positive influence in their life or not. And so I think that when we talk to parents about the responsibility of being a parent, we remind them that they don't get to choose who their children grow up to be. Like that's part of what happens, is that we are who we are as children and we find our own identities. And to the extent that they feel responsible as a parent, what it looks like to be a good parent today is to be supportive of these identities. So finding the right language to be able to make them feel that God has not rejected them, that they're not a failure, that they're not to blame for their kid being trans or queer. There's often a lot of shame. I can't tell you the number of parents who have told me that they feel in a religious setting that they feel like God has rejected their parenting because their kid is gay. And I immediately try to reframe it to them and say, Adarabba, perhaps it's because God needed a special parent, right, to be able to help guide and support this child that you were chosen. So either you can see this as part of your kind of ordination as a parent to be able to be supportive, or you could be in the opposition and be a bad parent. So you should use the right words to help them get there. But I think that's, at some point, it needs to be clear that that this is not their choice to make. And honestly, it's actually not a choice. It just is, right? I don't know, Jennifer, was there a specific piece that I didn't mention that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's complicated because it's sort of, what is our role vis-a-vis the parents as a school? Is our role to have these conversations with the parents? When do we bring the parents in? Do we advocate for the child? Are we neutral? What is the school role? We obviously want to support the child's well-being and protect the child. And that's in some ways our primary relationship, but we are obviously we want to be in partnership with the parents as well. And I agree with you that we want to move them along, but how do we do that in a way that that feels good on both sides? I think it's tricky.
It's super tricky, and it might not feel good on both sides at the beginning, because if a parent at this stage is in opposition, we can offer models like, look at this wonderful couple who, right, has maintained this religious identity or cultural connection and happens to be queer. I mean, there are things to show now that maybe 5 or 10 years ago were much harder. But I think I would say two things. I think it's absolutely the role of a school to advocate for the child. And I think at this point, I don't think anybody argues that not supporting your queer kid is unhealthy for the child. And so when we think about advocating for what is healthy for the child, I think it's now become kind of synonymous with, finding supportive adults in their life. But yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky.
Thank you.
Just to add, I have a question about like the age. Is there a difference between a 10-year-old bringing this up to a high schooler? Like we're in a position of middle school, like just with the involvement of the parents, as opposed to like the parents have more control and more choice about accepting or not accepting their child at different ages. Like any ideas about that? Sure.
Those are all very legitimate variables. One of the things that we've observed, and it's one of the bigger indicators that where gender exists is different than sexual orientation, is that often children from a much younger age are aware of their gender identity, even 3, 4, 5, 6 years old is not uncommon at all. And it's on some level independent of other people, as opposed to sexual orientation, which is very much an attraction to at least a category of people, which often happens later in adolescence. Adolescence, like all transitions, it's hard. It's really hard because it's neither here nor there. You're not an adult yet, and you're not a child. So you might have adult thoughts, and you might have, kind of a mature sense of like, I don't want to have to listen to people who I feel don't know better than I do. But at the same time, like, you're not in a position to pay rent or figure out how to drive. So it's difficult. I think that, to the extent that that children rely on parents, as educators, we need to engage the parents, right? If the kid's much older and is living independently, it's less significant for the parent because they're less reliable on them. They rely on them less. So as it's younger, it's much more important to both invest in the future, because there are more years that they're going to be together, and also to recognize that these things do take time. And the fact that a person isn't there yet does not mean that they can't get there. And there are things that reasonable people can disagree about, and that doesn't mean that they're homophobic or transphobic. I think giving space for parents to process. I mean, one example that comes up not infrequently is you'll have a parent whose kid is transitioning, and the parent's very supportive. I love my kid. I am here for them. I want to change the world for them. But they were named for my father, or they were named for my mother, and now they want a new name, and it's killing me, right? So that has nothing to do with being supportive or not supportive. It happens to be that the ask of being too supportive now has, something that's personal and painful, and that's also very real. In relationship, other people are affected by who we are and how we are in the moment, and it's very difficult to kind of hold all of that together. So I would say, as to the extent that the children are younger, to the extent that the parents really need to be invested in, for the long haul. But it's not simple. It's not simple. The other thing that I think is helpful for people to hear of a certain generation is, what it means to live an authentic and a true life. That there are always going to be consequences when there are things that change and shift. But if those changes are really an acknowledgement of something that was already different, right? This is who I am, and now I'm just letting you know. I think that some people have an easier time understanding that the alternative is not sustainable and not healthy, which is denying one's own identity. And so then, what does it look like to recalibrate for what is a win? What's the best case scenario now? But it's, people are complicated. And so the way in which they receive, these types of invitations and opportunities and challenges will also really vary. And it says a lot about, I think, people, how they respond. But whatever we can do to try to let them know that it is hard, and on a good day, it's hard. I think people can feel like in any challenging situation, the more support they have, the less they're carrying alone.
I'd like to, two things. One is, thank you for saying that God, the idea of God chose a special parent for this. I didn't come out until I was like 22, and I believe my parents are those special people who it took time, but they essentially got over it, and they're incredibly happy. I gave them grandchildren, there's like pieces to that. But that is something that is really important to me, to hear that. And then also, my question is, if you can dive a little bit deeper into this idea of non-binary being a fad, and how, so I work with a lot of synagogues, and one of the sessions that we provide in moving traditions is about gender, and the fact that we need to be accepting of non-binary kids when they're having their bar mitzvah and then beyond. And there's been pushback of parents saying, okay, so like, if you bring this to my kids, they're going to assume that this is okay for them to identify as non-binary. How do you respond to that and the idea of it being a fad?
Yeah. So when I think about what is essential about gender, whether it's the binary or the non-binary, it's almost always easier for me to kind of exclude things as being essential, like getting paid 70 cents on the dollar, right? Like that's a cultural piece that needs to get remedied. And so when we think about what, like the meta question about where does gender lie, both around the trans experience, is there a moment where Jewish law or Jewish tradition can say, okay, at this point you've crossed over that line? I don't know that we have access to that information. And I also don't know how important it is to be able to have access to that information. God has gendered attributes. God does not have a body. We're creating the image of a God that is imageless. So, when thinking about a tradition of gender-based spiritual practice, there, I think, is a lot to support in the argument that gender exists on a soul level, independent of the body. Sometimes the body reflects it, sometimes it challenges it. We are all unique blends and fragments of the divine. That is true in rabbinic literature everywhere. And so the way in which it manifests for some people is on one end of the spectrum of female, and others on the on male. The one person that was ever created really, God self used plural pronouns of they in the beginning of Genesis. And then everything else is stuff in between. In those places in between, for some people, there's an awareness of gender that incorporates both male and female. For some people, there's fluidity that it depends on the moment. I was at the thing in Toronto, and the most extreme example that I ever witnessed was there was a person who had a necklace, and then on the necklace had little squares, and one said he, and one said she, and one said they. And throughout the meal, they flipped them to be able to indicate to the world what pronouns to use in that moment. So that's an extreme example of, right? But that makes no sense to me I don't even know what any of that means. But as somebody who's able to observe and bear witness, I was sitting at a table with somebody who, for that, was very real. For that, in the moment, to be able to sense that awareness of gender, to say it in a way that maybe is easier to understand in this context, that when the Torah was given by Mount Sinai, the verse says, the entire nation saw the sounds. They experienced synesthesia. Most people don't see the sounds. Some people see sounds. By the giving of the Torah, everybody saw the sounds, because the Torah wasn't given for just the majority of experiences. The Torah was given for the most expansive of all the experiences. And when people are made aware of the experiences of other people, sometimes that's attractive. Oh, this person is roller skates or paints, or oh, that would be interesting. That, I think that's something that can trend, but that's not a function of an identity on a core space. They, them, as a way of referencing oneself, and there are a bunch of other pronouns that people use now. I don't see that as a trend. In that, not that it's not attractive to me as a trend, but I don't see it as a trend in breaking down the patriarchy or some other movement. I don't think it's a movement. I think that people are for the first time really being able to be given language that they can say, that resonates with me. That speaks about who I am. One example I heard once about the trans experience was somebody was told always you have to use your right hand to write. It turns out they're left-handed. So the first time they took a pen in the left hand, they're like, oh, right, this is what this is supposed to feel like. This is what's right. I had in the third grade, there was a girl in my class. She wanted to be going left-handed because she thought it was cool. It lasted an hour, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're not left-handed, it's going to be really annoying. I see conversations from the outside as oh, this is a fad. My father thought me becoming observant at 17 was a fad. It's my core. It's my most essential identities that I believe. That I like all of us are a child of God and all those things. So I don't see this as a fad. I think that we find trends that reflect something much more global and cosmic. And I don't think this is the last, stop on, on this ride for society in the exploration of gender. But I think once we can't even identify where gender exists really in that meta place, we should have a little humility that I don't know. But again, if we want that there should be some sort of covenantal restoration, if we're going to exclude people at the moment of their coming in, to say to them, you can come in if you're willing to come into Judaism as somebody else, but we're not willing to acknowledge your entrance into the covenant of adulthood as who you are, it's not gonna translate well, intergenerationally. So I think it's in our best interest, it's in the interest of our people, to acknowledge that a sanctuary is meant to be a safe space for people to be the most authentic and genuine version of themselves in relationship to God and community. I do have an article on it. I think maybe it's in the forward. It's called something like "Coming of Age in an Age of Being Genderqueer" or something. But basically, the way in which I framed it was a few years ago is that I see intimacy as an invitation and one that requires consent. And so really adulthood in Jewish law is really, I understand it as the age of consent to be in relationship with God. And part of what that does is it empowers the individual to advocate for themselves and tell the world who I am. And so I think really the question is not like, how do I think you should be called into the Torah, but how do you want to be called, right? Like that's the responsible response of, you're coming into an adult, so now you're an adult, tell us who you are, right? There's something that reinforces I don't actually see you as an adult if I'm not willing to trust you to tell me who you are.
Thank you.
Something that I've encountered in the past, but I'm not quite sure how to deal with this, is how to work with lay and professional leadership on understanding gender, especially when they say, oh, we don't have anyone who actually would be concerned about this, so we don't need to deal with it.
Yeah. It's a great question. In Rabbi school, we're taught we're not meant to answer questions, we're meant to answer people, because no one's life is ever hypothetical and there are no extra people in this world, and questions don't have a pulse. So when we think about, I don't need to do this because there isn't a person for whom this is relevant yet, it underscores that we're actually not doing the right thing. Because if somebody was there and I would have to act differently to accommodate, maybe the way in which I'm acting right now is not accommodating, right? Which is what's preventing them from coming. So I think that, we don't wait for somebody who needs a ramp to make sure that they're not only stairs, right? Because if we only have stairs, no one's going to come if they need to use a ramp. And so it's the right thing to do, even if everybody is able to walk, because it's the right thing to do. And I think that systemic racism and basically all systems of oppression look to perpetuate the status quo, because they advantage those who already have access. And so if we want to create more equity and equality, there needs to be more accessibility. And that means a lot of different things. That means accessibility of information, not just for those who can read, and not just for those who can see, not just for it's really, we want everyone to be able to feel empowered, to have access. And then if not, we're just, we self-select. And so I think part of what needs to be reinforced is that by choosing not to choose, you're making a really important conscious choice, which is, I'm happy with the people who are here now. And if other people didn't come, I would be happy for that as well. But that's what that choice means. Choosing not to accommodate means to choose to exclude. Again, you could say it nicer. You could say it in a nicer way, but I think that's the message that people need to hear, or it needs to be communicated. There's also, again, it's a great proof text. It says about Joseph that his brothers saw him from afar and sought to do him harm. From afar, it's easier to dehumanize somebody, right? Because they're not my people. We live in a different part of town. We speak differently. We have a different existence. I can't relate to them. And all of these systems continue to attempt to perpetuate that false narrative. If we want to have a relationship with God as a parent, we need to be able to take care of all of God's children as our siblings. And there are many that we don't know, and so it shouldn't be surprising, right? They're not showing up because they're not invited. Not only they're not invited, even if they're invited, they're not necessarily welcomed. Because what does it mean to be welcoming if you're not willing to acknowledge the ask of the identity? I don't mean to be so negative. I was in a great mood. It's not your fault. I don't mean to like reflect on all the brokenness. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I don't mean to be a buzzkill. Does anybody have anything positive to? I don't know.
I'll jump in with another question, and it's about pronouns on Zoom
Sure.
So, and again, more in the middle school context, and maybe there's some other educators out there who could help out. One of the conversations we've had around that is, does that, if we say we want everybody to identify their gender pronouns, or even if we say if you're comfortable, and most are comfortable, does that sort of either out kids, or does it reinforce the idea that, you know, especially we're a particularly small school, that all the kids look around and say, oh, look, everybody is, you know, cisgender here, and so we don't have to worry about this, or whatever it is, or I don't know, like wanting to be inclusive, but also not wanting to then somehow reify some of these ideas that we're trying to break down. So just, and maybe some other people have some ideas about that also.
Yeah, I would love to hear from other people. I think it's tricky. You know, if you're teaching in an all-boys school, to ask people to put up their pronouns, right? It's for sure going to out somebody. And if you're in a place where you know, some people do and some people don't, creating a policy might be really harmful to make people choose how to. Because it's one thing not to put it up there, because then there's ambiguity, right? You could say I didn't put it up there because I didn't put it up there. And so I think that that's also important to preserve, that not everybody wants to share right now. And sometimes the anxiety of like, I'd rather like not have to commit and say something that's not true about myself, can also be just the anxiety and the stress itself can be traumatizing. So I think some sort of the ideal is, you know, a realistic ideal is creating space that makes it very acceptable for people to share, but doesn't put on additional pressure too. Because there are people who might feel like, hey, this is the dumbest thing in the universe, and I don't want to be here if I have to do it. And if they're able to stay in spaces where there are genderqueer folks and people of trans experience, you know, it's not the job of those who are marginalized and oppressed to dig deeper to make it easier to change the world. But there is something about staying in communities where that proximity changes. It's one of the reasons in the last 50 years, there's been so much more change for the good, for race, for LGBT inclusivity and progress in those spaces as opposed to racial equality, in part because people can, you know, will bring their prejudices as soon as they meet somebody to see the color of their skin. But if you get to know somebody and then it happens to be that they're trans or genderqueer or gay, so then, you know, you already love them. And once you love them, it's harder to undo that. So I think we want to change and this is part of the struggle of, you know, being inside to change something or being on the outside to change something. You know, when do you try to find the low-hanging fruit, and when do you know, try to make advances and then come back? You know, historically, the Human Rights Campaign in particular kind of had this position of, you know what, let's work on the LGB stuff and even like the LG stuff and even like the L stuff before the G stuff, because like it's more palatable, and then like we'll have people in power who really get it, and then like for the trans folks, we'll come back for you. Like we'll come back and we'll get this once we've, you know, kind of addressed some of the other things, and then we'll have more power. I don't think people are ours to be able to do some sort of triage, like you're worthy of my, you know, it doesn't work that way. We have to do the right thing. And if we do the right thing, we'll end up in the right place. So I think it's tricky to hold all of those concerns of how do we like both advocate for the individual and for the community, that incremental change is real change. Maybe one other way of framing this is, and I know these words are offensive, but it took about 3,500 years to shift from seeing queer folks as like an intolerable deviancy to like a tolerable one, where perhaps some might say, listen, I'm not okay with this, but I'd rather you be here than not be here. That took about 3,500 years, and it's only happening now in some Orthodox spaces. To go from there to acceptance, and then from acceptance to celebration, I mean, for some people it's minutes or hours or days or months, but it's not thousands of years. And so the ability to have proximity, even if it's not ideal, it changes the baseline, and it advances the pursuit of the ideal. And again, it's never fair or acceptable to ask someone to compromise on themselves to slowly make other things better over time. But if people are able to be nourished in it, particularly if there's not an alternative, I think it does ripple.
Thank you.
I just wanted to, I just
Sure.
wanted to echo something you shared really in response to the question. What we did at our organization is after some staff education, we really made a policy that we would all have our pronouns in our email signature and in our Zoom names to really invite space for our learners and the folks we interact with to share their pronouns, and if that was something meaningful for them. And it's been very useful and helpful. And we've really only found that it's really positive when people want to share their pronouns with us. And for other folks, they don't even notice that it's something that exists and it's not really a conversation point.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful. And a lot of Jewish organizations now, even if not queer organizations, but just Jewish, kind of organizations, mainstream organizations, and it absolutely destigmatizes it. It like absolutely gives permission for people to think about it and to share. I was teaching at Georgetown this morning from this chair, and the really lovely woman is the rabbi who runs it. She wrote like she, her, and then in parentheses, they is also okay. Now, I don't know if they also identify as genderqueer, but acknowledging that here are mine and like I can answer to this, like it gives permission for people to think about. I mean, I identify with they as much as I identify as he. Like I happen to be a guy, and so like he is what makes sense in my head, but I don't feel masculine. So the book that's coming out in a couple of weeks is called Graceful Masculinity, and it's an exploration of 58 essays on the word chen, grace, in Sefer Yetzirah, in the one of the earliest mystical work in our tradition. The author says that the letter Taf, the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, governs over the word chen, grace, governs from within, energizes it, and it forms the word chatan. Chatan as a groom is an archetype of masculinity, and so it's on all the different parashiyos and on the festivals, and their essays on identifying male attributes or gendered attributes in tradition, and trying to find more positive framings. In our tradition, we have all sorts of words for mansplaining and toxic masculinity, but we don't really have a way of thinking about it in a positive way. And I think that they can be identified in gendered spaces, but then elevated and applied in non-gendered spaces. And so, I mean, I think for myself in a cerebral space, the they feels more authentic to me, but not like in an embodied gendered, I feel this way. I don't feel he, she, or they. And I think that on the I'm just sharing here, that on the spectrum, I think I'm really far to one side of both, of being like completely unaware of gender in my lived experience beyond my body. And so like I'm always so, I don't know, I guess maybe humbled or I don't know. I feel moved when people are able to give language to their own awareness of those spaces. And I think that one thing that people who don't like internally feel that is that they can like really validate and affirm and invite and give permission, to the extent that we're somehow gatekeepers of that, for people who do feel those things to lean into it and to see what it does for them. So I think in that way, like putting pronouns is great for everybody, even for people, right? It's great for everybody. Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is nobody's ever said to me, "Oh, you don't look Jewish," right? There's certain things that I take for granted that have never been questioned, and my masculinity is one of those. My male identity is one of those, as is my Jewish identity, and I also, just to be sensitive that not everybody is in that space, and so for those who are in that space to be able to make it more accessible to others, I think there's holiness in that. Anyone who hasn't spoken yet would like to say something? Has anyone found success in speaking particularly to older people? This is a very generational, the world's changing very quickly. And so I think the struggle for young people today is a very different struggle than for people in the past, and it'll continue to evolve. But I'm curious if folks have anything that they want to share that the group might find to be helpful.
I didn't have a generational conversation, but I had a conversation with somebody, a cultural conversation, somebody from Russia who whose daughter came out as or wanted to transition into being male identifying. I'm sorry if I'm saying it wrong. But the father had a really hard time with understanding and ultimately accepting who this kid was. And in the conversation, the father was telling me about all the different mental health issues that his child was dealing with. And he knew or believed that they were in response to the struggle that the child was having, but still couldn't bring himself to figure out how to support that child's moving forward. And so that was, I don't know if it was a cultural thing. I feel like it was a cultural thing. I never, it was a coaching consult essentially that went on for an hour and a half. And at the end he said, "So what do you think?" And I said, "I think you need to support your child." I mean, that was really the end. And I actually followed up with the quote that you said which you brought up again today about do you want a lesbian daughter? Do you want a lesbian daughter who celebrates Shabbat? Like, I thought that was so clear and just like so crystallized it for me. And his response was, "I'll get back to you to let you know if I want to talk anymore." So he wasn't ready to hear it from his child. He wasn't ready to hear it from anybody else. And, like, we can't make people come into that moment. But I feel like as educators, as people who invest their lives in the lives of young people, we do owe it to the young people that we support, that we care about, to be their advocate. And even if those words fall on deaf ears of their parents, that we're still there as an advocate for their children to make sure that they have the best opportunity to have a healthy, happy, successful adulthood.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can't fiat attitude and you can't force someone to be your friend. You can try to make it as easy as possible, and be their friend and hope that they reciprocate. So I did write an article with the head of the transgender center at Mount Sinai for Brandeis, something like, advancing the rabbinic prescription for trans healthcare. And one of the things that I think is helpful in having these conversations is that often people feel justified in their position when it's often quite hypocritical, whether it's around homophobia or transphobia, and being able to point out, when people say, well, if God wanted this person to be this way, then why didn't they make that, right? So we don't say that about a deviated septum or a hole in the heart or any other thing that requires medical intervention. And mainstream science-based medicine now sees that the trans experience is much more biological than it is anything else, whether it's medical, mental, or emotional. He brings in the article a few examples that if with identical twins, if one is trans, there's a 40% chance that the other one will be trans, as opposed to if they're not identical twins, then it's the same as the national average. And he was an endocrinologist first. And so when we think about the conversation that we need to have with God at the end of it all about our actions and our inactions, it's always easier to justify something that's an unknown by saying that we filled that space with love. I mean, it's what the Gemara does when it doesn't know the answer. It says teku, which is an allusion to Elijah the prophet, who was given this covenant of peace. And the other thing is that for a long time, conversion therapy was seen as legitimate. There was a doctor, Rabbi Dr. Norman Goldwasser, and he argued that being gay was a response to trauma, that if you could heal the trauma, then you could kind of, heal away the gay. And he was very popular. I've actually known him for many decades now, but his daughter was actually the one who was the left-handed student in my class. But he made national news about 3 years ago when he was trolling the internet for men. And many of the people who are the most anti, kind of queer inclusivities, they're really just very suppressed themselves. And so it's everybody loses, right, when we deny the reality of people's experiences. And you cannot paskin a shaila until you know the mitzvahs. You can't answer a question in Jewish law until you're able to acknowledge the reality. So, science and rabbis, we get a lot of questions and we don't always know the answer. But part of the work is listening and learning. And as we learn more about the trans experience, we're in a better position to be able to answer the questions at those intersections. And it's certainly becoming very clear that this is something that we know more and more about, but there's still a lot we don't know. But again, the urgency of what do we do now in the moment to make this, a supportive and loving experience, that we don't need to have all the answers for it to be able to show up.
Rabbi, I know you only have a couple more minutes, so I want to make sure you're watching the clock, and maybe if there's a final thought you have or a final question, I think we're good.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have to tell you as educators, we don't teach material, we teach students. And the Gemara says that the temple was destroyed because we denied access to students to school. And the Maharsha, I believe in the back of the Gemara, points out that that if the Jewish people were not worthy, if the Jewish people were not in a place of having the sensitivity to appreciate the holiness of children, so then we weren't then able to deserve having a building, which is on a lower level of spirituality. A building doesn't have a soul; it doesn't have any sort of intrinsic holiness. And when we think about the place that we're in now, in this place of destruction, where we forced God back into the closet, God is very hidden. I see the divine revelation as God's coming out speech. If we want this world to change, we needed to create a safe space for God to be able to be out as God, as who God is. And one of the ways that we can do that is by really appreciating the holiness of each student, and the way in which they are a unique reflection of the divine. So I would just like to encourage everybody that, to the extent that something is different and maybe something you're not familiar with, it's probably, a great indicator that there's a lot more for us to learn, and that by seeing and understanding, that which is different than ourselves, we're actually able to tap into a much more holistic view and understanding of the divine, the source of all genders and of all things. So just want to thank you all for doing this holy work. And I know it's not easy, but it does get better. And for advancing the cause.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Rabbi, do you want to put your email in the chat in case anybody wants to connect with you after the webinar?
Sure. I have a website that has about 120
perfect.
or 30 articles. But yeah, the website I think is Rabbi Moskowitz, Rabbi Mike Moskowitz.com or something. I don't know, but I'll put my email address here if anybody has questions or is looking for particular articles. So yeah, Rabbi Moskowitz at cvst.org. And yeah, it's part of chasing the joy and resistance is all part of spiritual practice, and seeing allyship as such, really can be nourishing and nurturing. And so we should continue to be compassionate with ourselves and hope that translates in the world being, more compassionate towards us. So thank you again all for this opportunity, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you very much.